The attributes of Allah. The word Allah is lafzul jalala. Lafz means expression or utterance or pronunciation. And jalala means greatness. So we have it here, the expression of majesty. Lafzul jalala. That means the name of Allah, the word itself, the name of Allah. It is the alam, the proper name of Adhatul Muqaddas, the holy self. The only mustahiq, the only one who's deserving of or entitled to worship. We already defined worship in the previous volume. Hence, the named one, Allah, is a that, a self. Some people, some of our brothers and sisters, they don't prefer the word self. They say a being. And his self is his reality, not a body. The selves of the creatures are their bodies. His self is also called his nafs and his wajh. His nafs, that's what Prophet Isa said. He said, La a'lamu ma fi nafsik. If you translate that literally, it would mean, I don't know what's in yourself, O Allah. You know what's in myself, and I don't know what's in yourself. That's a literal translation of the statement. Now, I don't recall a good way to explain the tafsir of the ayah. The only reason I'm bringing it up is to give you a reference for this word. Nafs is the self of Allah Ta'ala. And also his wajh. That's what's in Surah Ar-Rahman. وَيَبْقَى وَجْهُ رَبِّكَ. The wajh, which means the self of your Lord, remains, is everlasting. This self is ascribed with attributes. Ascribed means attributed. He says, Allah that is, وَلِلَّهِ الْمَثَلُ الْأَعْلَى. Allah has the sublime ascription, the attributes of perfection. Al-mathalu al-a'la. So mathal here it means ascription, attribution. And a'la means higher or highest. So it's translated here as Allah has the sublime ascription. That means he's attributed with the attributes of perfection. A sifa or wasf, that's an attribute or ascription or description, is what informs about a self. So the original word is wasf, wasf, waw, sod, fa. And the derivative word is sifa, although we use sifa more. It is also permissible to use the term not, according to some, like At-Tahawi. It also means attribute. Because At-Tahawi says Allah is mawsuf bi sifat. He's attributed with attributes. And he said he's man'ut bi nu'ut. Nu'ut is the plural of not. It means the same thing. The scholars also use ma'na, meaning or connotation, for an attribute beyond a mere self. For an attribute beyond a mere self. What does that mean? An attribute beyond a mere self. It means that sometimes when you think about an attribute, what it means, Yani, when you think about the meaning of an attribute, since it's an attribute, that means there must be a self that has this attribute. But this attribute itself means something more than the self that it implies. So there's a self, and there's an attribute that its meaning is more than the meaning of that self. They call this ma'na. Ma'na means meaning or connotation. For example, speech is a ma'na in some of his names, like ash-shahid. Ash-shahid means witness. It means who testifies on Judgment Day that he sent his messengers with truthfulness, as interpreted by Abu al-Muzaffar. He also explained al-Ba'ith as who sent the messengers, saying that sending messengers is by speech and testifying is by speech. That's the implication. Al-Mu'min was explained by some as who witnessed for himself that no one is God but him, and who witnessed for his believers that they are truthful in their belief that no one is God but him. Abu al-Muzaffar said it means who verifies the truthfulness of his prophets. So all of that implies speech. He also included among those names Al-Mujib, the one who answers the needy who asks him, and rescues the yearner if he calls upon him. Yani Mujib means the answerer or the responder. All of these names have the connotation of speech, and speech does not mean knowledge, and speech does not mean will. Each one of those has its own meaning, and each one of those, its meaning is something more than what self means. When learning the books of the scholars, the context must be observed. Sometimes sifa or wasf is used for the derived names of Allah, like Al-Khaliq, the creator. Derived means comes from a source in the language, a name that comes from a source in the language. So, for example, Allah has the attribute of Qudrah, power. So that's the source of the name Qadir, powerful, or Qadir, also powerful or very powerful. And Khaliq, for example, it comes from Khalq. Khalq is the source of the name, the adjective, the description. Khaliq. So these names that are derived, these names that have a source in the language, sometimes the scholars call them attributes. So you have to pay attention to the context. And sometimes you'll be talking to a person, he doesn't know how to differentiate. He doesn't know the difference between name or attribute. So you might say the attributes of Allah, he thinks you talk about the names of Allah. You might say the attributes of Allah, he would say, oh, you mean like Allah has 99 attributes? So you'd say to him, you mean the names, those 99 names of Allah. It is valid to call those names of Allah attributes. Just all we're saying here is it's important to keep the context in mind so you don't get mixed up. So that you know that if we're saying attribute, are we talking about the actual attributes or are we talking about the names? It is permissible to call the names of Allah like Al-Qadir, the powerful, his attributes, except the name Allah. It's not valid to call that an attribute. So even if someone said, oh, you mean like the 99 attributes? They'll say, no, that's 99 names. And it's not even valid to say 99 attributes here because one of those 99 is Lafdhul Jalala. And Lafdhul Jalala is not valid to call it an attribute. The name Allah, not that one because it refers to his self, not any particular attribute. So Al-Qudrah, for example, Al-Qadir, for example, refers to the name, Bismillah. Al-Qadir, this name, refers to the attribute Qudrah. Al-Alim refers to the attribute Ilm, etc. Al-Hayy refers to the attribute of Hayah, etc. But the name Allah refers to his self, not to any particular attribute. When the attribute's contrary meaning is impossible and imperfection for Allah, such as ignorance being contrary to knowledge, then that is an attribute of the self. So we say Allah has sifatu that, attributes of the self. How do you determine that an attribute that you're hearing about is an attribute of the self? Then you investigate or ponder on the contrary meaning of that. If the contrary meaning of that is impossible and it is imperfection, then this attribute is called sifatu that, an attribute of the self, an attribute of the self of Allah. So all the 13 attributes are attributes of His self. Each one of them, its opposite, the opposite meaning of it is impossible and imperfection. When the attribute's contrary meaning is not impossible nor imperfection for Allah, like providing or not providing, that is a doing, a fi'l or an action. Sifatu fi'l, an attribute of doing. And their difference about the doings shall come. The Ash'aris and the Maturidis differ about how to explain the doings of Allah. So we'll not jump ahead now. We'll wait till that comes and we'll explain it when it comes. So all we're saying here, the synopsis of all of what we just read is this. Allah Ta'ala, He is a that, a self. That's not a body. This self has attributes and He has names and He has attributes of the self and He has attributes of doings. Wa subhanallahi wa bihamdi. That's all clear. The perfection of God, Kamal, that's one of His attributes. Al-Kamal. Our Shaykh, yani, it's an attribute of His self. It's a self attribute. Our Shaykh has dedicated an independent chapter to this topic in As-Siratul Mustaqim. The attributes of Allah are all attributes of Kamal, attributes of perfection. But that doesn't mean that His attributes have an attribute. No. All His attributes are attributes of perfection. That's true. But that doesn't mean all of His attributes have an attribute. Rather, what it means here is Kamal, perfection, is an attribute of His self. And therefore, since Kamal is an attribute of His self, then all His attributes are perfect. Same thing we say about being eternal. We say all of His attributes are eternal. That doesn't mean that His attributes have an attribute. Rather, His self is eternal. So since His self is eternal, then His attributes are eternal. And same thing for everlastingness. All His attributes are everlasting. That doesn't mean that His attributes have an attribute. Rather, His self is everlasting, and therefore His attributes are everlasting. The names of Allah are all names that denote absolute perfection. He is attributed with all befitting perfection and clear of all non-befitting attributes, like we learned in the Mukhtasar. Perfection has several facets. Some qualities or attributes or ascriptions, and we mean here words in the language, they indicate perfection or excellence. Yani, to understand this case we want to talk about now, the perfection of Allah. This goes back to words. The words you use, what do they indicate? Do they indicate perfection or excellence, or do they indicate imperfection? So all this is going back to word usage. So some qualities, we mean here, some words, when you use them, they indicate perfection or excellence. So we're going to use the word perfection for Allah. We're going to use excellence for the creation. A word may have a general meaning of perfection or excellence. And it could be said about Allah and others. The same word. One word has the meaning of perfection or excellence. And this word, you can use it for Allah and you can use it for others too. Or not. So that's really three scenarios there. When we say, you can say it about Allah and others or not. That's three scenarios. Because that means either you can use it for Allah and others, this word, or You can use it for Allah only, or you can use it for others only. It's three scenarios. So a word may have a general meaning of perfection or excellence and be said about Allah and others, or not. Or not means might only be said about Allah, or might only be said about others. The first is like knowledge. It is said about Allah and others, and is considered good in both cases. The difference is that the excellence or perfection of the creatures accepts development from one echelon to another. Their excellence is relative, it's comparable, and it varies and changes. To the contrary, the attributes of Allah are all eternal. They do not develop. The eternal, everlasting self is attributed with sight, hearing, speech, and other countless eternal, everlasting attributes of befitting perfection. The attributes must be eternal because the self is eternal, like we said, yani his attributes. And he does not acquire an attribute that he did not have eternally. And he does not lose an attribute. So all of this tells us the contrast between the attributes of Allah and the attributes of the creations. Contrast. Another important word. We cannot compare Allah and the creations, but what can we do? We can contrast. Contrast means tell the difference. That's how you challenge a Wahhabi. When the Wahhabi says, why do you not accept that Allah has hands and face, but you accept that Allah has knowledge and power? You translate this literally, knowledge and power, and you don't translate yet and ayn literally. Why? We say, because his knowledge is different from the creation, and his power and his etc. are different from the creation. They will say, well, his eyes and his face and his hands are different from the creation. So right there, then you tell him, what's the difference? He won't have an answer. So what's the difference? He's not expecting that question even, because he doesn't know what he's saying.
You were giving the example about the Wahhabis, they say like, yes, Allah has a face and hands, but it's different from that of the creation.
Mm-hmm.
And then you say to them like, how is it different?
Yeah, what's the difference?
What's different? What if they say something like, this is perfect and ours aren't?
If he said that to me, I say, what does that mean? Then what do you think he'd say? That's the best he can do. So I'll say to him, see, you don't even know what you're saying.
What if they say something like, well, you're saying that his attributes are attributes of perfection, like you're saying he has knowledge and power, and you're saying they're of perfection. So I'm saying that they're of perfection.
Yeah, but I'm able to tell the difference, though. I can tell you the contrast. Because when I say he has knowledge, it means knowledge without a beginning and without an end. He didn't learn something or have a teacher. And we say, for example, he's alive. He's alive without a body and without a soul. And he hears without ears and he sees without eyes. So we're telling you the difference. You tell me the difference when you say he has a hand. What's the difference? And he won't be able to tell you anything. If he says it's perfect and ours aren't perfect, then he's just using generic words, trying to not get caught.
Not the Wahhabis are the ones who say that like Allah puts his foot in.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, the Wahhabis are the ones who say Allah puts his foot in hell. Mm-hmm. But the Mushabbiha existed in the past. So Wahhabis are just a reiteration, like a reincarnation of Mushabbiha from before. Like Ibn Taymiyyah, technically he's not a Wahhabi, but they follow him because he believes like them.
What's the reason for
saying what?
that Allah puts his
Because of the hadith. حتى يضع رب العزة قدمه. So the hadith is that on Judgment Day, batches of people will be put into hell, batch after batch. And then hellfire would be asked, Halim talat, are you full? And then hellfire would say, Hal min mazid, is there more? And then batches will be continually put in there. And then the Prophet said, Hatta yada'a rabbul izzati qadamah. So according to the Wahhabis, this means hellfire will keep asking for more until the Lord of Glory puts his foot. And then hellfire will say, Qat, I'm full. MashaAllah. The meaning is that until he puts a batch of people in, and that batch of people will be Gog and Magog, because there's so much of them, so many of them.
But the word literally is
Qadam. The word is qadam. Hatta yada'a rabbul izzati qadamah, his qadam. So qadam means foot. There's another version of the hadith means rijl, says rijl. Rijl also means foot. So for them, this is more emphatic. They say, look, both versions. One says qadam, one says rijl, must be a foot. So the qadam is, we explain qadam to mean that which was put forward. That which was put forward. That's the meaning of qadam. From the letters qaf, dal, meen. That's why a foot is called qadam, because you put it forward. And rijl means a group also. One of its meanings is a group. MashaAllah. Yes. Authentic hadith. I don't remember who reported it though. MashaAllah. The attributes must be eternal because the self is eternal. Okay, we just read all of that. He does not get better or worse. At-Tahawi said, ما زال بصفاته قديما قبل خلقه. Having his attributes, he existed eternally before his creation. لم يزدد بكونهم شيئا لم يكن قبلهم من صفته. The existence of his creations did not add anything to his attributes that he was not attributed with eternally. That statement right there means he's not over the throne. His throne is a created thing. So according to Wahhabis, Allah created the throne and then he rose over it. But according to Tahawi, and he's documenting the creed of the Muslims, and he's from the Salaf, the existence of his creations did not add anything to his attributes that he was not attributed with eternally. وَكَمَا كَانَ بِصِفَاتِهِ أَزَلِيًّا كَذَلِكَ لَا يَزَالُ عَلَيْهَا أَبَدِيًّا. And just as he and his attributes are eternal, he and his attributes will always be everlasting. Our Shaykh said in the summary, فَلَمَّا ثَبَتَتِ الْأَزَلِيَّةُ لِذَاتِ اللَّهِ وَجَبَ أَن تَكُونَ صِفَاتُهُ أَزَلِيَّةً لِأَنَّ حُدُوثَ الصِّفَةِ يَسْتَلْزِمُ حُدُوثَ الذَّاتِ. Since eternity is confirmed for the self of Allah, then it is necessary that his attributes be eternal, because createdness of the attribute entails createdness of the attribute itself. I think that's clear. Any question there? That's clear? Yani, if an attribute is created, then whatever has that attribute would be created. It's not possible that an uncreated one would have created attributes. And it's not possible that a created one would have uncreated attributes. So since eternity, which means uncreatedness, not being created, since not being created is confirmed for the self of Allah, it is then necessary that his attributes are not created, because createdness of an attribute entails createdness of the attribute itself, the self that has that attribute. It is not possible that the eternal self has a created attribute, yani that the uncreated self has a created attribute. From this, the scholars said that Allah is alive unlike the living things, powerful unlike powerful things, and willing, unlike willing things, and knowledgeable, unlike knowledgeable things. And none of his attributes resemble the attributes of the creations. So now we just talked about the case of what could be used, what some words that could be used for Allah to indicate perfection. And those same words could be used for the creations too to indicate excellence. But they're not the same. They don't mean the same. It's just the same word. The second has two cases. It would either be perfection for Allah and imperfection for the creature, or perfection for the creature and imperfection for Allah. Perfection for Allah and imperfection for the creature is like God's name, Al-Jabbar. When used for Allah, it means the one who corrects the matters of his creation. Or it means the one whom no one can harm. And it has other meanings. Other things have been said. It has other tafsirs, this name, Al-Jabbar. However, when the same word is used for the creation, it means a tyrant or a bully. And that's imperfection. Same thing for his name, Al-Mutakabbir. For Allah, it means the one who is great. For the slave, it would mean the one who's arrogant. So this is a word that when used for Allah means perfection, and when used for the creature means imperfection. And perfection for the creature and imperfection for Allah is like intelligence, good health, nice voice, and the like. For humans, these are perfections, but for Allah, they are imperfections because they are created attributes. His attribute of kamal, perfection, is called al-azamah, greatness, al-ulu, highness, or majesty. And highness doesn't mean in a place here, but that's obvious. Al-izzah, glory or magnificence. Al-rif'ah, highness or majesty. Al-kibriya, magnificence or awesomeness. And fawqiyah, highness or majesty. All of those are names for the same attribute. Because sometimes one attribute has more than one name. We'll see. It is Allah's deserving the attributes of majesty and the ascriptions of majestic highness and perfection. That is His holiness beyond resemblance and His exaltedness from the attributes of occurring things. It is His freedom of need, His glorification from imperfection, and His description of Godhood. Anyone who attributes a defect or imperfection to Allah is not a Muslim, like who claims that his knowledge increases, or that he has nearness or farness by location, or a shape. Insulting Allah by giving him a sister or a son is blasphemy, even if one does not believe that Allah has a sister or a son. It is blasphemy to believe that one can develop until he reaches the perfection of Allah. That's a fake Sufi belief. Wa subhanallahi wa bihamdih. The 13 attributes. According to a saying of the Maturidiyah, Allah is attributed with attributes that we cannot count, yani countless attributes. He's attributed with unlimited attributes, uncountable attributes. That's what Maturidis said. Some are obligatory to be known with detail and some are not. By agreement, ittifaq, there are 13 attributes called the attributes of the self of Allah, or the dhatiyah attributes, sifatu dhat. So they are called sifatu dhat, the attributes of the self, or they're called as-sifatu dhatiyah, the self attributes, the attributes pertaining to the self. Because the self of Allah is not known without knowing them. These attributes are qa'im, confirmed, for the self of Allah. Qa'im means really existing. That's the meaning of confirmed. Confirmation here means existing. It is impossible that Allah would be attributed with what is contrary or contradictory to these attributes because of what is confirmed by the intellect and the texts of the religion. The intellect denies that Allah would be attributed with the opposites of these 13. And the texts of the religion also deny that. What is contrary to these attributes are all imperfections that prevent the validity of Him creating, like non-existence, then He wouldn't have created anything, or ignorance, then He wouldn't have created anything, etc. The one who never thought about Allah having these 13 attributes, but He never denied them, and he never doubted about one of them, he is not a blasphemer. If he believed in the basic meaning of the two shahadas and pronounced that, he is indeed a Muslim. So right now we're talking about a person who basically is oblivious. He's heedless. He didn't think about Allah having these attributes, or not having them, though. Neither way. Rather, he just believed in Allah. He said the shahada, he believed God exists, and he didn't ponder. He didn't say God exists, He has no beginning, He has no end, and He doesn't need anything, He doesn't resemble anything. As long as he didn't deny them, he's still a Muslim when he said the shahada, believing in it. And as long as he didn't doubt about them. It is not a condition for the validity of one's conviction that he knows extensive details, or even that he knows the specific name of any particular attribute. If he doesn't know any of the names of the attributes, this is not kufr, as long as he believes in them or believes in their meanings. Believing in it is sufficient, nor is it an obligation to memorize the terminology, yani to memorize those names verbatim. It's not a condition to be a Muslim. It is obligatory to learn their meanings. The scholars said whoever negates them is not a Muslim. He is a blasphemer. It was the habit of the later scholars who authored works about the creed to declare it an obligation on every accountable Muslim to know 13 attributes of Allah. This does not mean that the Salaf did not mention them at all. They did, like Abu Hanifa in Al-Fiqh al-Akbar, but not constantly declaring the obligation to know them. Also in Tahawi, he mentions the 13 attributes. He didn't list them though. He didn't say, Allah has 13 attributes. They are, and then gave you 13. So if you want, look through Tahawi, open the creed of Tahawi, and then go through and then find all the 13 attributes. You'll see how he scattered them. So they did mention these 13 attributes like Abu Hanifa and Al-Fiqh al-Akbar, but not constantly declaring the obligation to know them. They said knowing them is a personal obligation because they were reiterated throughout the Quran and the Hadith, either explicitly or implicitly, more than other attributes. Explicitly is like when Allah says, Ahata bi kulli shay'in ilma. He encompasses everything in ilm, knowledge. So that's explicit mentioning of the attribute. Also, when Allah says, Ya'lam, He knows, that's a verb. That's an explicit mentioning of the attribute too, mentioning the verb. And when Allah says, وَهُوَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عَلِيمٍ, He is about everything knower, that's an adjective. And that's an explicit mentioning of the attribute too. So those attributes are mentioned in the Quran explicitly, and they're mentioned implicitly. That means indirectly. Like when Allah told us that Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam said to his father, لِمَ تَعْبُدُ مَا لَا يَسْمَعُ وَلَا يُبْصِرُ وَلَا يُغْنِي عَنْكَ شَيْئًا. Why do you worship what does not hear and does not see and does not avail you in any way? So that implies then that God hears and sees, because he tried to teach his father by telling him, why would you worship something that doesn't hear and doesn't see? And also other places. For example, when Allah says, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, this implies that Allah exists as the attribute of existence. Praise be to Allah, Lord of the worlds. Also implies that Allah is different from the creations because He's the Lord of the worlds. That means He's not the worlds, He's not part of the worlds, He's not one of them or something of them. He's different from them. He is their Lord. And other attribute and other ayahs in the Quran like that, and other hadiths also, from which you can extract the attributes without them being mentioned explicitly. These 13 attributes can be derived from Suratul Ikhlas, as seen in the talk of Imam Abdullah ibn Ahmad al-Nasafi in his book of interpretation, Madarik al-Tanzil wa Haqa'iq al-Ta'wil. He said, his saying, Hu Allah, He is Allah. It is a sign that He is the creator of the things and their fatir, their originator. Included in that is His ascription of being powerful and knowledgeable, because creating requires power and knowledge, for it occurs with the ultimate degree of perfection, harmony, and order. And in that is His ascription of being alive, because the one ascribed with power and knowledge must be ascribed with life. And that is an attribution with hearing, sight, will, speech, and other attributes of perfection. Had He not been ascribed with them, He would be ascribed with what contradicts them, which are imperfections. That is the indication of createdness. Thus, ascribing the eternal with that is impossible. And this Nasafi is a Maturidi, by the way. He's a Hanafi and a Maturidi. His saying, Ahad, He is one, it is an ascription of oneness and the denial of partnership, and that He exclusively is attributed with giving existence to the non-existent, and that He is the only one who knows all of the hidden matters. His saying, As-Samad, the Samad, the sought master needed by all, it is an ascription that in terms of being needy or not, He is needed only. So what's in parentheses there, I added it for clarity. The way An-Nasafi said it is an ascription that He is needed only. And if He is not ascribed except with being needed, then He is absolutely independent, not requiring anyone, and everything requiring Him. Some scholars will probably repeat it. I'm going to add it when I get to it, inshallah, when I see the right spot. Some scholars, they regard this as being the general meaning of Godhood, the absolute independence. So what did we learn? We learned that Godhood, the meaning of Al-Ilah, according to one saying, it means the one who can create. And according to another saying, it means the one who deserves worship. Some said Al-Ilah means the one who's absolutely independent. That's what As-Sanusi said. His saying, Lam yalid, He did not beget. It is a denial of resemblance and typicality. Typicality means having a type. His saying, Walam yulad, and He was not begotten, it is a negation of createdness and an ascription of eternity and beginninglessness. His saying, Walam yakul lahu kufuwan ahad, there was never for Him any equivalent. It is a negation that anything resembles Him. So that's 11 attributes. Here he mentioned 11 out of 13. And he could have mentioned all of them. All the other 13, the last two, he could have mentioned them. He skipped existence because it is obvious. Nor did he mention everlastingness, but it's understood from the eternality without a beginning. He could have derived everlastingness like he derived power, knowledge, life, hearing, sight, and speech. That's clear? Because we say, if someone is eternal, then he'd be everlasting. So once it was confirmed here, eternality, then everlastingness is confirmed too, although he didn't mention it. Benefits. Some of the attributes have more than one name in Arabic. Eternity or eternality is called al-qidam or al-azaliyah. Independence is called al-qiyamu bin nafs. That means, if I translate it very literally, it means self-subsistent or standing alone. Al-qiyamu bin nafs, standing alone. It means existing by himself. And istighna, al-istighna, and it's called al-ghina. Those two mean the same. Al-istighna and al-ghina. Well, al-istighna, it means independence, not needing something. That's literally what it means. If you tastaghni from something, means you don't need it. And ghina means wealth, richness. So here for Allah, as an attribute of Allah, it means independence. And his name is Al-Ghani. It's one of the 99 names, Al-Ghani. Power is called Al-Qudrah or Al-Quwwah. Will is called Al-Irada or Al-Mashi'ah. Sight is called Al-Basar or Al-Ru'yah. Speech is called Al-Quran, Al-Kalam, Al-Qawl. Qawl means saying. Al-Kalima, Kalima means word. And Al-Kalimat, Kalimat means words. Well, Shaykh Rabi', he doesn't accept word though for Allah. Of course, he accepts the Arabic word. Kalima, that comes from the religious documents. Kalima and Kalimat, that's from the religious documents. It refers to Allah's attribute of speech. But he doesn't accept to translate it as word. The last I knew when I spoke to him, Shaykh Rabi'. The word of Allah, or the words of Allah. Personally, I think it works, but it's not a big deal. Yani. I'm not gonna argue with anybody about that. It's easy. And it's easy matter. Yani, a person doesn't have to use English words anyway. You don't have to say word or words. But the word kalima, it means speech sometimes. Like if you say, I want to have a word with you, or something like that. Allah has attributes. This is second benefit. Allah has attributes such as takween, giving being, which is creating, and it shall come. So according to this, creating is itself an attribute. When we learn the 13 attributes, the attribute that's related to the issue of creating would be power. We learn Allah is attributed with power. His power is his attribute by which he makes the non-existent come into existence. And he renders the existent non-existent. And his will is his attribute by which he makes a possibility one way or another. But according to another way, and this is the Maturidi way, creating is itself an attribute other than power and other than will. And Sheikh Abdullah really takes this way, although in most of his books he doesn't list takween as a separate attribute, as an independent attribute. But he goes that way. The takween is an attribute besides the 13. And that's the Maturidi way. And qadar, that's an attribute of Allah. It is the taqdeer, destining. The Shaykh said, وَالْقَدَرُ هو تدبير الأشياء على وجه مطابق لعلم الله الأزلي ومشيئته الأزلية فيوجدها في الوقت الذي علم أنها تكون فيه. The qadar is the tadbir, the management of things, in a way that complies with the eternal knowledge of Allah and his eternal will. He makes them exist at the time in which he knew they would exist. It is managing everything in accordance with the knowledge, power, and will, and it shall come also. Qadar, we have a section for it. Ihata, we have written here, encompassments, really means Omniscience. Omniscience. I'm going to change it. Omniscience. Did I spell that wrong? Yeah. Omniscience. Ihata, which is his all-inclusive knowledge and power. It is a figure of speech to express that just as an encompassed matter does not escape what has encompassed it, nothing about the creatures escapes Allah, and they do not render him powerless. According to this, we explain such verses as the saying of Allah, Ala innahu bi kulli shay'in muhit. I just added those words there, the saying of Allah, so I could push the Arabic down to the next line. I don't like for the Arabic to be broken in 2 lines. So when I find that, sometimes I'll add or subtract so that I can get the Arabic on 1 line. According to this, we explain such verses as the saying of Allah, Ala innahu bi kulli shay'in muhit. Is it not that he is muhit, omniscient of everything? Is it not that he is omniscient of everything? وَأَنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَحَاطَ بِكُلِّ شَيْءٍ عِلْمًا, and that Allah definitely has encompassed everything by knowledge. So that encompassed, the encompassment mentioned here, that's the omniscience. And وَاللَّهُ مِن وَرَائِهِم مُحِيطٌ. Allah is knowledgeable of their situations and has power over them. So very literally, it's like saying Allah is beyond them, omniscient. The attributes of the self are eternal and everlasting by the consensus of the people of truth. None are eventually occurring within the self, and thus do not increase or decrease like the attributes of the creation. They do not dwell in the self, nor overcome each other, nor cancel each other. وَسُبْحَانَ اللَّهِ وَبِحَمْدِهِ.